This video is about some basic philosophical distinctions we're going to need in philosophy of science. First, I want to talk about a distinction in epistemology between what we call a priori and a posteriori knowledge. And then we're going to talk about a distinction in semantics between what we call analytic statements and synthetic statements. And we're going to see that these are two distinct distinctions. They're different ways of thinking about knowledge. One of them, the epistemological distinction, has to do with how knowledge is justified or confirmed, whereas the semantic distinction has fairly recently been expressed in terms of meaning, and that's why it's about semantics. Okay, so we're going to first start with the distinction between a priori and a posteriori knowledge. What's the difference there? Well, let's say that when we claim that a statement is a priori, what we are saying is that we can know that it's true and prove that it's true using only our intellect. So a claim is a priori if we can establish its truth, or if we can justify its truth using only our intellect. And then we simply say that a claim is a posteriori, just in case it isn't a priori. And we do that on purpose so that we end up with two mutually exclusive and exhaustive categories of knowledge. So we're going to say that a claim is a posteriori if it is not a priori. And if we reflect on what that means, we can say that is if experience is required to justify its truth. Okay, so what we're defining on the right is what it means to say that a statement or a claim is a priori, and we're going to say that it's a priori if we can justify its truth using only our intellect. And on the right, we're going to say that a claim is a posteriori just in case it's not a priori. That is to say, if experience is required to justify the truth of the claim. Now, for most philosophers, a good example of an a priori claim is a statement like 2 + 2 = 4. Because most philosophers would agree that this kind of statement is a statement that you can prove using only your intellect. Same thing with any other mathematical statement. For instance, Pythagoras' theorem for right-angle triangles, right? Most philosophers would agree that what justifies the truth of this statement at the end of the day, if our life depends on it, is a mathematical proof and not any measurement that we would arrive at on the basis of experience. And this is certainly the way that the logical empiricists saw mathematics. They saw mathematics as being a priori. Now, on the other side, concerning a posteriori claims, most philosophers would agree that anything that Hume would have said as a matter of fact counts as an a posteriori claim. So this is another way to think about it. The distinction between a priori and a posteriori is just like Hume's distinction between relations of ideas versus matters of fact. And the logical empiricists agreed with Hume on this way of dividing knowledge into two styles or categories of claims depending on how they are justified. So for most philosophers, something like the earth is round is a perfectly good example of an a posteriori claim. Whatever we need to do to prove that the earth is round surely goes well beyond merely using our intellect, because we need experience of some sort. We need to measure things or observe things in order to justify, or loosely speaking, prove the claim that the earth is round. And the logical empiricists thought that all our scientific knowledge was a posteriori. Okay? So this is one kind of distinction that has to do with how knowledge is justified. So it's all about the justification for certain kinds of knowledge, and that's why we call it an epistemological distinction, because epistemology is a branch of philosophy that examines the nature and the scope of human knowledge. Now I want to talk about the other distinctions separately first, and then we're going to bring them together, okay? So let's now talk about the analytic synthetic distinction. And just to keep things parallel and as simple as I can, I'm going to try to restrict our attention to single statements. So we were just talking about a priori statements and a posteriori statements. Now I want to talk about analytic statements and synthetic statements. This distinction was made famous originally first by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, and later became really the core of logical positivism, one of the core sort of distinctions and concepts in logical positivism. So what is the distinction? Well, it turns out that it's kind of tricky to describe what exactly it means to say that a statement is analytic, and there's different attempts at doing so, beginning with the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, but I'm not going to use Kant's way of talking about analytic and synthetic right now. Instead, I'm going to use a slightly later version from the history of philosophy, and we're going to say that a claim is analytic just in case it is true in virtue of the meanings of the words it contains. Okay? So a claim is analytic just in case it is true in virtue of the meanings of the words it contains. And then we're going to say that a claim is synthetic if it's not analytic. So a claim is synthetic if it is not analytic. And we're doing the same thing that we did with a priori, a posteriori distinction, where deliberately setting up two classes of statements that are mutually exclusive and exhaustive. So a claim is synthetic if it's not analytic, that is, if its truth depends on something other than the meaning of the words, the meanings of the words it contains. The meanings of the words it contains. So the infamous example of an analytic claim is all bachelors are unmarried males. These claims are called analytic in part because the idea is that what we're doing with this kind of claim is analyzing the concept of bachelor. We're breaking it down into its component ideas, so to speak. So the idea of a bachelor is made up of two other ideas, the idea of an unmarried person and the idea of a male person. And so a claim that is analytic, Kant would have said, is merely explicative and not ampliative. Okay, it's explicative because it helps us understand something, but it doesn't, in any deeper sense, amplify our knowledge. It merely explains to us what are the conceptual relationships among different kinds of concepts, but it doesn't teach us anything new about the world. Now, synthetic claims are claims that must be true, not because of the way the words are defined or the meanings of the words, but they're true in virtue of something else. And what that something else is controversial in the history of philosophy. But for a straight up, simple, logical empiricist view, what makes synthetic claims is simply the way the world is. So for a synthetic claim here, we can use as our example the example we had used before. Let me not say the world, let me say the earth is round. Now these are not very sciencey examples. And so if I wanted to start thinking more philosophically about science, I might think of a definition on the side of analytic claims, a definition from a science, as an example of an analytic claim. And then I might think of some other claim that isn't merely true in virtue of the definition being expressed as an example of a synthetic claim. So now, there's, strictly speaking, 4 possible combinations for a claim to be either analytic or synthetic and either a priori or a posteriori. So let's lay that out in a very simple chart. So I'm going to put a priori and a posteriori along one axis, and then analytic and synthetic along the other axis. And then we can ask what kinds of combinations make sense. And different philosophers have defended different views on this. So almost all philosophers will agree that there are some statements that are analytic a priori. And in fact, it's sort of hard to see how you could ever have a statement that is analytic and a posteriori, though some philosophers have defended that. But for the most part, if a statement is true in virtue of the meanings of the words, which means that it is an analytic statement, then definitely you don't need any experience of the world to justify that it's true, so it's going to turn out to be an a priori statement. Okay? Likewise, if you think about a synthetic claim, such as the earth is round, it seems pretty straightforward to say the synthetic claims must be a posteriori, because synthetic claims are not true in virtue merely of what the words mean. They're true in virtue of something else. And so that something else is going to have to be something that makes the claim true. And in most situations, except maybe for mathematics, which is a very tricky one, you want to say that what makes the claim true is something about the way the world is, and so you need experience from the world to justify its truth. So you are over here and you're thinking that synthetic claims are a posteriori. Now, the tricky question here is, what about a synthetic a priori claim? And Kant deserves credit for being the one famous philosopher in the history of philosophy who tried to defend the view that there are synthetic a priori claims. Now, what would that be? That would be a claim that we can know is true simply by using our intellect without requiring any kind of experience from the world, right? That's what makes it a priori, that it's true simply because we can make a proof for it using our intellect. But it's synthetic because it isn't merely an expression of what words mean. And for Kant, it was very important for him to try to defend the view that both arithmetic, geometry, and some of the most general basic laws of nature were synthetic a priori, as were claims about the nature of space and time. The logical positivists rejected Kant's view about the synthetic a priori. So when you read that back in the article by Suppi, that there was, at the time of the development of logical positivism, a certain amount of neo-Kantianism that was trying to defend a view like the one I've just described, the logical positivists strongly rejected that. For the logical positivists, the only two kinds of claims that we can have are analytic a priori claims and synthetic a posteriori claims. The analytic claims are going to be, for logical empiricists or logical positivists, simply definitions and the consequences of definitions. So for logical empiricists, mathematics goes here. And that's why it's empty of content and filled with tautologies, because everything in mathematics is true by definition or as a consequence of definitions. On the other hand, for the logical empiricists, the only kind of legitimate knowledge that is synthetic a posteriori is scientific knowledge, and it goes here. And everything else we should toss out as nonsense. Okay? So for the logical empiricists, it's true that maybe a little bit of science is in here in the analytic a priori, because some parts of science merely define what words mean, but they get connected to the synthetic a posteriori, by correspondence rules. And so for the logical empiricists, this analytic-synthetic distinction was very, very important. It was as important as the distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact was to Hume. And what we're going to see in the readings by the American philosopher W.B.O. Quine is that Quine is going to argue against the analytic-synthetic distinction, and he's going to call it a dogma of empiricism. So I hope this reminds you of some of the things that maybe you've learned in another philosophy course or you've seen before. And remember, it's important to keep distinct the epistemological distinction between a priori and a posteriori claims, which is about justification, and the semantic distinction between analytic and synthetic claims.